Let's begin with the foundations. Welcome to another lecture. Today we examine Alan Greenspan, a name that, for better or worse, became synonymous with modern central banking. We will try to separate signal from noise. I am Alexei, and with me is Priyanka.
Hi, I'm Priyanka. We're talking about the Fed chair whose sentences could move trillions of dollars. No pressure on us today.
To frame our discussion, Alan Greenspan was the 13th chairman of the Federal Reserve, appointed in 1987 by President Ronald Reagan, and serving until January 31, 2006. Only William McChesney Martin served longer. The Federal Reserve, of course, is the United States Central Bank, tasked with monetary policy, financial stability, and bank regulation. Its main instrument is the federal funds rate, the overnight interest rate influencing credit conditions across the economy.
Can we say a little more about monetary policy itself? Like, what is the basic lever and what does it touch first?
Monetary policy sets the short rate and, through expectations, influences the whole yield curve. Credit costs, housing finance, business investment, exchange rates, and asset valuations all respond. In Greenspan's era, the watchwords were inflation control and output stabilization. He was, in broad terms, monetarist with Austrian sensibilities, while often tracking Taylor rule-style prescriptions without following them mechanically.
And the Greenspan put that people talk about. What exactly was that, in simpler terms?
The Greenspan put was an informal market belief that after sharp asset price declines, the Fed would ease or supply liquidity. The pattern was reinforced by the 1987 crash response and later episodes. Supporters viewed this as necessary stabilization. Critics argued it cultivated moral hazard by socializing downside risk and arguably inflating subsequent booms.
And objectivism. That's Ayn Rand's philosophy, right? How did that enter the picture?
Yes, Greenspan had close ties to Ayn Rand in his early career, writing in defense of laissez-faire and even the gold standard. He later emphasized that democratic governance requires compromise. After 2008, he famously acknowledged a flaw in assuming self-regulation would suffice. Yet he still defended competitive markets as superior over time. The tension between ideal and institution is one of our recurrent themes today. Moving forward, why does this matter now? Greenspan's choices shape norms: when to cut, how to speak, how much to trust markets. His policies and posture inform current debates on moral hazard, macroprudential regulation, and the trade-off between transparency and central bank optionality. Many misunderstandings arise from the fact that monetary policy can stabilize the near term while quietly accumulating financial risk through the credit channel. What appears benevolent in the present can be costly in the future.
I think the stakes feel tangible. Rate cuts after shocks can save jobs, but if they encourage too much leverage, the next downturn can be worse. And the communication style itself can change how much investors reach for yield. It's a delicate feedback loop, not a simple switch.
Let's start with the history. Greenspan took office in August 1987. In October, the stock market crashed, and the Fed promised liquidity, an early seed of the put. He served across multiple administrations, was reappointed by President Bill Clinton in 1993, and helped manage the 1994-1995 support for Mexico during the peso crisis. In 1999, alongside Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers, SEC Chairman Arthur Levitt, and CFTC Chairman William Renier, he endorsed a stance that many over-the-counter derivatives be exempted from the Commodity Exchange Act. The environment culminated in the Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000, which would be revisited critically after 2008. After the dot-com boom, he raised rates in 2000. Critics later said he should have cooled exuberance sooner. Post 9/11, the Fed cut the funds rate, reaching 1% in 2004. Refinancing and housing activity surged, stabilizing growth while increasing household leverage. In February 2004, he discussed adjustable rate mortgages and product diversity. Later hikes toward 5.25%, plus weak underwriting, contributed to subprime resets and distress. In April 2005, he warned about systemic risk from the large portfolios of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and separately flagged concentration risks in certain derivatives markets. He retired in January 2006. Ben Bernanke succeeded him.
And then, in 2007, he published The Age of Turbulence. He had written much of it by hand, in the bathtub. Surprising, but true. He also took advisory roles with PIMCO, Deutsche Bank, and later Paulson & Co. Then came 2008. He wrote in the Financial Times that reforms should not stifle market flexibility, drew criticism, and in October told Congress he had found a flaw in relying on self-regulation. Time named him among the people to blame. Inside Job amplified that narrative. It makes me wonder how he balanced defending markets with admitting error.
It is worth noting the persona. He rarely gave broadcast interviews while chair and cultivated Fed speak, a deliberately opaque style, once joking about learning to mumble with great incoherence. He studied at Juilliard, played clarinet and saxophone with notable jazz musicians, and was nicknamed The Undertaker by Ayn Rand. In later years, he argued that the worldwide decline in long-term interest rates, the so-called savings glut, did much of the work on housing. Many critics disagreed, attributing more to low short rates and light touch oversight. The debate defines much of his legacy, and he remains a figure of enduring controversy. Before we get to the complexities, a brief personal note. We observe, from a classroom vantage point, how a single sentence in a Fed chair's testimony can change the reading list for the entire semester. When Greenspan spoke, global lenders, students, and ministers of finance all recalibrated. Even those far from Washington felt the ripple through exchange rates, capital flows, and quite literally, mortgage coupons. The reach of that office is extraordinary. This brings us to three big questions. First, historically, how did Greenspan's policies shape financial crises? Second, counterfactually, what if he had supported tighter derivatives regulation in the late 1990s? Third, prospectively, how should future central banks balance regulation and market freedom? On the first question, did his policies shape the crises? To some extent, yes, through three channels. 1. Easy money in the early 2000s stabilized growth, but via housing finance and equity extraction, amplified leverage. 2. The Greenspan put arguably conditioned markets to expect accommodation after drawdowns, encouraging risk-taking at the margin. 3. A deregulatory posture toward over-the-counter derivatives contributed to opacity and risk concentration. Critics such as Paul Krugman, Joseph Stiglitz, Robert Reich, and Steve Forbes faulted him on these dimensions. Defenders like Martin Wolf have argued he became a convenient scapegoat for broader global forces, including the pronounced decline in long-term yields.
I'm curious about communications. If Fed speak was deliberately opaque, could that have worsened mispricing? Like, did markets fill in the gaps with their own optimistic stories?
A fair question. The intent of Fed speak was to avoid false precision that could whipsaw markets. Opacity protected policy flexibility when the data were noisy. While ambiguity can allow narratives to proliferate, the evidence suggests the larger drivers were price incentives and underwriting practices rather than ellipses in testimony. Still, we can infer that communication shapes expectation formation. When paired with the perceived put, even careful phrasing may have been read as reassurance. It is a reminder that language, like interest rates, is a policy instrument with side effects.
So yeah, moving on, the second question. What if, in the late 1990s, tighter derivatives regulation had been supported, the CFTC had early efforts, the official stance leaned toward exemptions? What are the plausible effects if that had gone differently?
Let's consider the counterfactual carefully. Derivatives are useful for hedging and price discovery. They also create opacity and interconnections. Had the United States embraced comprehensive oversight in the late 1990s, for example, trade reporting, centralized clearing with margining, and capital or conduct standards for major dealers, counterparty risk could have been better mapped and collateralized. The result might have been less uncertainty about who owed what to whom in 2007-2008. Fire sale dynamics could have been mitigated at the peak of stress. This is not a magic wand. Poor mortgage origination would still have been poor. But the plumbing for risk transfer could have been less brittle, particularly given Greenspan's own 2005 warning about concentration in certain over-the-counter interest rate options. In simpler terms, transparency and buffers buy you time, and in crises, time is oxygen.
I guess the trade-off is innovation speed versus safety. Can we say tighter rules might have slowed some product growth, but reduced the tail risks from hidden linkages?
Precisely. Markets adapt, but when adaptation occurs within transparent, well-capitalized channels, the system is less likely to seize under stress. A chess player prefers open lines with defended pieces. One can still lose, but not to a trap you never saw. On to our next point, the third question. How should future central banks balance regulation and market freedom? The contemporary toolkit includes rules on bank capital and liquidity, stress tests, countercyclical buffers, and the lender of last resort backstop. The art is calibrating these without freezing the beneficial dynamism of competition. Greenspan's post-crisis essays urged us not to hobble market flexibility. His congressional testimony conceded he was partially wrong about self-regulation. The synthesis is not ideology but incentive design. Align private risk-taking with social resilience, and communicate policy with enough clarity to anchor expectations while preserving optionality.
If I may suggest a philosophical angle, is objectivism still relevant here? Or has the experience since 2008 moved us toward a more pragmatic middle ground?
Objectivism's emphasis on property rights and competition remains a powerful baseline intuition. Markets aggregate information and allocate resources with remarkable efficiency. Yet modern finance has externalities and opacity that individual firms cannot price fully, thus guardrails. Greenspan himself tried to reconcile this by citing democratic compromise, and after the crisis, by refining the claim. Competitive markets are best, provided information is credible and incentives are aligned. We also note his related policy views: support for trade openness with adjustment assistance, focus on education to address inequality, and advocacy for high-skill immigration signal a belief that adaptability, not protection, is the durable answer to disruption.
What comes to mind next is energy and geopolitics. He warned that oil flow disruptions could be catastrophic. even argued for removing Saddam Hussein partly for energy stability. Does that widen the central banker's risk map today?
It does. Energy choke points, supply shocks, and their transmission to inflation expectations and financial conditions are part of the macroprudential landscape. The lesson is that monetary authorities cannot ignore real economy bottlenecks. Future research priorities include measuring systemic risk in non-bank finance, disentangling global savings and term premium dynamics, designing communications that avoid a de facto put while preserving crisis credibility, and improving cross-border coordination when shocks travel via trade and energy prices as quickly as via swap lines.
So, I guess that kind of sums it up. Alan Greenspan was a long-serving Fed chair whose policies and style shaped modern central banking. He stabilized crises, fostered the Greenspan put expectation, and later admitted a flaw in relying on self-regulation. We asked 3 questions: how his choices influenced crises, what tighter 1990s derivatives regulation might have changed, and how to balance market freedom with robust guardrails going forward. The study of central banks is, clearly, a study of trade-offs and timing.
To summarize, we should continue examining how rate policy interacts with credit channels, how macroprudential rules modulate cycles, and how communication strategies shape risk-taking. This then completes our present analysis. Thank you for listening. Until next time.